Hello, this is Salvatore Vinciguerra. Welcome to this video on the Old North Church in Boston, Massachusetts. This virtual tour will take us to the top of the bell tower of the Old North Church to follow the footsteps of Paul Revere and discover his connection to the bell-ringing chamber. We're also going to go underneath the church and walk among the 37 tombs in the crypt. The Old North Church was built in December 1723, inspired by the works of Christopher Wren, the British architect who was responsible for rebuilding London after the Great Fire. Timothy Cutler was the founding rector, after serving as the third rector of Yale College from 1719 to 1722. In a sea of white square pews, this overly sized burgundy pew stands out. It was owned by the gentlemen of the Bay of Honduras, ship captains and merchants involved in the longwood trade in the Central American country of Belize. Longwood was highly valued for the richly colored dyes extracted from it, used in textiles and clothing. This industry, however, depended upon extensive labor of enslaved Africans shipped to Belize specifically to extract longwood and mahogany. Between 1724 and 1740, the gentlemen donated over 50 tons of this valuable commodity to the church, which then sold the longwood to fund the construction of its first steeple in 1740. This large prominent pew reflects the gentleman's standing in the church and community. The furnishings you see here are not unique. Congregants originally owned their pews and decorated them to make the worship experience more comfortable and fashionable. Many pew owners furnished their spaces with fabrics, cushions, chairs, and even wallpaper to suit their tastes, wealth, and social status. In comparison, this is the Revere pew. Paul Revere's son, Joseph Warren Revere, bought this pew in 1808, and it is still owned by his descendants today. Paul Revere was an American silversmith, engraver, early industrialist, and patriot in the American Revolution. He is best known for his midnight ride to alert the colonial militia in April 1775 to the approach of British forces before the battles of Lexington and Concord, as dramatized in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem Paul Revere's Ride in 1861. And I'll be talking about Paul Revere a little bit later in this video when we tour the bell tower. As you're looking inside of the beautiful church here in Boston, you should note that the original interior was far more vibrantly painted and more ornate than what you're seeing here in these pictures, which is very stark and white. The Old North Church is a mission of the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts, and it is the oldest standing church building in Boston and a National Historic Landmark. Inside the church is a bust of George Washington, which Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette, reportedly remarked was the best likeness of the first president he had ever seen. And here is the second part of the tour, which is actually going into the bell tower. And in April of 1775, Paul Revere told 3 Boston patriots to hang 2 lanterns in the steeple. These men were the church sexton, Robert Newman, and Captain John Pulling, the 2 of whom historian David Hackett Fisher suggests each carried 1 lantern up to the steeple, as well as Thomas Bernard, who stood watch for the British troops outside the church. The lanterns were displayed to send a warning to Charleston patriots across the Charles River about the movements of the British Army. Revere and William Dawes would later deliver the same message to Lexington themselves, but this lantern method was a fast way to inform the backup riders in Charleston about the movements of the British. These backup riders planned to deliver the warning message to Lexington and Concord in case Revere and Dawes were arrested on the way. The lanterns were hung in just under a minute to avoid catching the eyes of the British troops occupying Boston, but this was long enough for the message to be received in Charleston. The militia waiting across the river had been told to look for the signal lanterns and were prepared to act as soon as they saw them. The meaning of these two lanterns has been memorized by countless American schoolchildren. One if by land and two if by sea is from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1860 poem, Paul Revere's Ride. One lantern was to notify Charleston that the British Army would march over to Boston Neck and the Great Bridge, and two were to notify them that the troops were taking boats across the Charleston River to land near Phipps Farm. After receiving the signal, the Charleston Patriots sent out a rider to Lexington, but this rider did not reach his destination, and his identity has disappeared from history, having possibly been captured by a British patrol. But the warning was delivered miles away to dozens of towns, first by Revere and Dawes on horses, and then by other men on horses, and men who rang church bells and town bells, beat drums, and shot off warning guns. The current status of the lanterns is not entirely clear. One is said to be in the hands of a private collector, another was broken during a tour, and yet another is on display at the Concord Museum. Now let's listen in to our tour guide to tell us about the bell chamber.
There was a group of about 15, 16-year-old boys from this neighborhood who drafted a contract with the first rector, Timothy Cutler, which basically states they don't want to be members of the church, because this was Church of England and they were Congregationalists, but they do want to be welcome here once a week to teach themselves how to ring the bells. So the second signature down is actually a 15-year-old Paul Revere. He was one of the first bell ringers here when he was 15, although he was never a member of the church, but probably aided in his plans to use the building for signal lanterns 25 years later, because he was very familiar with the layout of the building. Does anybody know what change ringing bells are? Usually the answer, yeah, actually, one 8-year-old boy in the last 3.5 years knew. Change ringing bells, you've definitely heard them before, but Indian bells, which when they're rung, produce a melodic tune. So you can ring a song on those bells and identify it. However, change ringing bells create a cascade of sounds based on numeric patterns, depending on how many bells you have. So for example, we have 8 bells here. Bell number 1 is this first rope, weighs 620 pounds, and is treble F, and then that last rope on the right is bell 8, and it's 1,500 pounds and is tenor F. So it's a full octave, and you can ring them in any order, 1 through 8, make over 40,000 different combinations of sounds. And this will make more sense in a second, but I like to pass these books around. So this is called Diagram.
Yes, if you listened very carefully to the tour guide, this is a copy of a 1750 charter of the Bell Ringers Guild, which they agreed upon a democratic organization of the tower and its bell ringing practices. Paul Revere is the second signature on the contract, and he was a bell ringer at the Old North Church when he was only 15 years old. And it is very interesting that at this time he was not a member of this church, but he was still allowed to ring the bells of the church. Now let's get back to talking about the bell ringing tower itself. This is the oldest set of change ringing bells in North America, and these 8 change ringing bells were cast by Abel Redhall in Gloucester, England in 1744 and installed here in 1745. Here are some of the books of how these bells are supposed to be rung, with the different frequencies and the different combinations that they can make songs. The bells were restored in 1894 and then were mostly idle. They were restored again in 1975 with the help of Godfrey Davis of Simon W. Robinson Lodge in Lexington for the Boston Bicentennial celebration, and they have been rung regularly ever since. There are 8 bells above this tower, so you see the pulley system here where the bell ringers would be inside of the tower and operate the bells from this particular room right here. Each of the 8 bells is tuned to a different frequency or musical note. For example, bell 1 is tuned to treble F, and it weighs a certain amount of pounds, and each bell has an inscription on it that documents the history of this particular church. So it's a very interesting place to visit. and tour to take if you ever get the opportunity to visit the Old North Church. This is the crypt tour of the Old North Church, and it's in the basement section of the church. As you can see, there's a separate entrance in order to get here. And yes, you can be buried here as well for only about $15,000 or so, according to the tour guide. So it's very interesting just to walk around this particular area and then go into this area where archaeologists are still uncovering new things in these tombs in the basement section of the crypt. And in 2009, archaeologists began examining the estimated 1,100 bodies buried in these 37 tombs. The crypt was used between 1732 and 1860, and each tomb is sealed with a wooden or slate door with many doors covered over by plaster as ordered by the city of Boston in the 1850s. This piece of paper, which was found in the tomb area, shows you how the bodies would have been stacked in each of the different sections that they would have had for maybe a family. This is what a typical tomb would have looked like, and these are the coffins. As you can see, they're made out of wood. The one on the shelf is maybe one for a child, and then the one that is bigger on the left-hand side is one that would have fit an adult. And it's very intriguing to see the amount of space and the construction that they would have had inside of some of these tomb areas. There are many notable burials underneath the Old North Church. This is the tomb of Captain Samuel Nicholson of the USS Constitution. I just found it interesting how people stack different coins on top of his engraving for his memorial plaque. The founding rector, the Reverend Timothy Cutler, and his wife are buried underneath the altar together. Other notable figures buried underneath the church include British mariner Major John Pitcairn, who died due to injuries received at the Battle of Bunker Hill and was entombed along with many soldiers killed in this battle. This is Salvatore Vinciguerra. Thank you for watching this video on the Old North Church in Boston, Massachusetts. If you like this video, please like it, subscribe to this channel, and have a great day. Thank you.